Chapter 1. East to War. The sun had fallen below the western horizon. Ahead, the smoky plume of Mount Mihara on the island of Oshima could no longer be seen. Far astern, the lights of Tokyo and Yokohama cast a glow upon the sky. Sita Nobuo Ishikawa, commanding officer of His Imperial Majesty's Submarine I-15, told me to have all hands fall in on deck aft of the conning tower. I was Ishikawa's executive and torpedo officer. All day I had been wondering when he would give us word of I-15's mission. That morning, November 21, 1941, he tersely told me, "We will sail this evening. Get her ready for sea." He had then gone to the training cruiser Katori, flagship of Japan's submarine fleet, for final instructions, without telling me any more. Of course I knew that something important was happening. The Sixth Fleet, Japan's submarine force, had undergone intense and severe battle exercises from June to August of that year, in areas as far apart as the icy Kuriles and the torrid Mandated Islands, as well as off Japan and Formosa. During September, all boats returned to their home bases for full refit. The international situation had already tightened by the time I came aboard I-15 in March of 1941. Our Commander-in-Chief, ADM Isoroku Yamamoto, had told his superiors he thought it was reckless to wage war against the American and British navies, but nevertheless he was determined to do his best if war did come. In January he thought of the idea for an attack against Pearl Harbor, stronghold of America's Pacific Fleet. In that same month, top military men of the US and Britain conferred in Washington, D.C. about the possibility of a war with Japan. Early in February, Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, Chief of Staff for our Navy's 11th Air Fleet, called Sea Dr. Minoru Genda to Kanoya for discussions. Genda was considered one of our finest pilots. The top group of flyers he gathered about him was called Genda's Flying Circus, and they were largely responsible for the high state of training of our naval air arm. "Here, Genda," said Onishi, showing him a letter from Yamamoto. "Make a study of this Pearl Harbor idea, and let me know if you think it can be accomplished." Genda was back with an answer in 2 weeks. "It can be done," he said, but listed 3 absolute requirements, without which success was impossible. 6 of our large aircraft carriers would be needed, and these staffed by our very best pilots, and the attack would have to be brought off with complete surprise. In February also, our 4th Fleet was established at Truk in the Carolines. Contrary to what most of the world believed during World War II, the Mandated Islands were not heavily fortified when the war began. Their lack of fortifications, in fact, was one of the major factors in deciding to attack Pearl Harbor. Both Japanese and American naval men had long thought that a war between their 2 countries, if it came, would begin in the areas south of Japan. The American Navy expected to have to slam its way across the Central Pacific, through the Mandated Islands, to join up with its Asiatic fleet in a mass assault on the Imperial Navy. Our Navy had to plan to block such an approach and prevent such a rendezvous. It had little chance of blocking it, though, so long as runways, anchorages, and fortifications in the outlying islands were non-existent. The attack on Pearl Harbor, therefore, dangerous as it was, seemed the logical answer to our main problem, stopping the American fleet in its tracks. If American warships were sunk or immobilized for many months, Japan would be free to exploit the southern areas, seizing their resources, and to prepare for the day when the American fleet was built up again. The 4th Fleet, meanwhile, with its force of 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 16 submarines, would be sufficient to defend the outlying islands if the Pearl Harbor attack were successful. During March, when I came on board I-15 as executive officer, Japan obtained a monopoly on Indochina's rice crop, which was badly needed, and the right to use the French airfield at Saigon. During that same month, President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Bill and made the speech in which he said, "When your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him a hose." He meant that America would help Britain against Germany, but not go to war. In April, our Navy established the First Air Fleet, composed of 6 carriers, and our best aviators were ordered to its air squadrons. The US occupation agreement with Greenland was signed in that month too. Some American experts on international law described the agreement as legally indefensible and claimed the man who signed it for Denmark, which owned Greenland, had no authority from his government to sign. Japan and Russia signed a non-aggression pact that month too. Our national leaders decided to open negotiations with Washington in an effort to settle what they called the China problem and to avoid war with the United States, if at all possible. At Singapore that same month, men of 6 nations that opposed Japan's policies met to discuss how Japan should be handled in a war. Their final decision was that Great Britain would send a striking force to Singapore as soon as possible. Should war come, the US fleet would contain the Japanese fleet with strikes in the Marshalls and Carolines, while the Dutch, together with the US Asiatic fleet, would take care of local defence and convoy escort until all the Allied forces were massed together for a strike against our navy. In May, our ADM, Yamamoto told the Naval General Staff of his plan to attack Pearl Harbor. ADM. Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, vigorously opposed the plan. He felt that Japan should secure the vast resources and raw materials of the southern area first. The aircraft carriers Yamamoto wanted for the Pearl Harbor attack represented 60% of what we had. If we lost them, Japan would be at the mercy of other Pacific naval powers. In June, the submarines of 6th Fleet were allowed to fire 1 torpedo each against the steep shoreline of Oshima Island, due south of Tokyo Bay. These tests proved out the mighty Model 95 torpedo. She was the underwater sister to the surface, carried Model 93, the weapon that would hurt the enemy so badly at Java Sea, Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and in other battles. The midget submarine carrier Chiyoda, publicly listed as a seaplane carrier, carried out tests with her tiny submersibles off the eastern shore of Kyushu and the western shore of Shikoku, in areas that resembled Pearl Harbor. At that time, midget submarines were a secret kept not only from the Japanese public, but also from nearly all of the Japanese Navy as well. Germany attacked Russia that month, an action that tended to make the northern flank of Japanese defences more secure. Top Japanese planners decided to stay out of the Russo-German War, concentrating instead on gaining full control of Indochina. Not only would its great food output solve some of Japan's internal problems, but its location would provide bases for a great southern advance when the right time came. On July 2, 1941, the famous Risk of War Imperial Conference was held, with Emperor Hirohito present. Fearful that the ABCD powers, America, Britain, Dutch, Chinese, were tightening a noose around Japan's neck, the conferees decided to rush ahead with efforts in the south and strengthen Japan's position in Asia, even if it meant war. Japan was to press ahead in Indochina regardless of the consequences. A powerful attempt would be made to end the China difficulties, and it was also decided that Japan will not decline a war with Great Britain and America in the process of achieving its national objectives. More than 1 million reservists were called to arms right after that, and all Japanese merchant ships in the Atlantic Ocean were ordered to their home ports. The Americans had broken Japan's diplomatic code by July. They knew Japan had pressed Vichy France and received for approval our complete occupation of Indochina, which was then French territory. President Roosevelt, although he knew that France had given approval secretly, proposed that Indochina be allowed to remain a neutral area. When Japan rejected his proposal, he made loud public issue of it and ordered Japan's assets in the United States frozen. Holland followed suit, freezing Japan's assets the next day, and Great Britain gave Japan notice that she was terminating all commercial treaties. It was obvious that the tempers of all national leaders concerned were being heated to the point of hysteria. Unless someone calmed down, yielded, or retreated soon, it would be too late. Practically all of Japan's trade came to a halt when her overseas funds were tied up. Her supplies of oil, the lifeblood of any industrial nation, were cut off. She had to reach an accommodation with those who opposed her, or go ahead and fight for what she felt she needed to survive. She finally chose the third course. Very little of these high-level matters was known to the Imperial Submarine Service, except what we heard in news dispatches over the wireless during manoeuvres. We were concentrating on shaping the world's finest submarine navy. Though small in numbers, the Sixth Fleet's construction plans were ambitious, and we were very powerful for our size. In August, the one move that might have prevented the Pacific Naval War was proposed by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to President Roosevelt at Newfoundland during their famous Atlantic Conference. The cigar-puffing British bulldog proposed that America, the Netherlands, Britain and Russia make a joint declaration to Japan that any further southward movement on her part would automatically mean war with these four nations. Churchill knew that a Russian threat from the north would temper Japan's ambitions. Mr. Roosevelt rejected the suggestion. He reasoned that American public opinion was not yet strong enough to support such warlike statements. Actually, his fellow citizens considered happenings in the Far East extremely remote from American interests. As one reporter put it, Americans couldn't get very excited about what 70 million Japs were doing to 6 times that many Chinks. After Mr. Roosevelt got back from Newfoundland, he and his Secretary of State conferred with our ambassador, Mr. Kichisaburo Nomura, about resuming talks and arranging for a Pacific conference with our foreign minister. On August 27th, Japan protested the shipment of Lend-Lease goods through Japanese waters to Vladivostok, from which port they went overland to Russia for use against our German allies. The next day, a joint conference in Tokyo decided that war, if it began at all, would have to begin in November or December 1941. November was better because tides, phase of the moon and typhoons were more favourable. Winter snows would hold back the Russians in either month if they got any ideas about attacking Japan. After December, however, we would have dipped very far into our critical oil reserves. In any case, a decision would have to be made by early October, so plans could be completed and executed no later than December. After that month, Japan's enemies would be too powerful for her to challenge. All this information, of course, was knowledge a lieutenant less than 10 years out of the Naval Academy at Etajima could not possibly have had at that time. It has taken much reading and study on my part to ascertain these facts. During this period, high-level manoeuvring and note-exchanging was going on. I worked very strenuously at the only trade I knew, whipping a submarine and its crew into top readiness. Our Sixth Fleet had 3 squadrons of submarines at the time the war started, including one made up of obsolescent boats that were used for training practice in home water. My boat, I-15, was in Submarine Squadron, Sub-Ron 1, and I was one of 3,000 officers and men who manned the boats of what was called the Advance Force. Basic pre-war strategy centered around my squadrons advancing deep into enemy waters and keeping watch on his naval ports. Should he sally forth to attack the Japanese homeland, we were to attack him, then use our high surface speed of 23 knots to dash away and set up a second ambush for him, repeating this tactic until we were out of torpedoes. If, in spite of the damage we did to his fleet, the enemy kept advancing toward Japan, our combined fleet would sortie to meet him with boats of Subron 2 and Subron 3 screening far ahead of it. Those submarines would repeat the tactics of Subron 1. Theoretically, by the time the enemy closed with our main body for the one decisive sea battle admirals dream of, he would be so weakened that he could be crushed. Japan would win control of the Pacific Ocean. In September 1941, about 40 of Japan's highest-ranking naval officers shut themselves up in the Naval War College at Tokyo for nearly 2 weeks. There they worked out tabletop maneuvers for the opening of a war they were sure was coming. The Pearl Harbor attack was only one part of a plane of operations that would span nearly 1/3 of the world's circumference, and not many were in favor of the thing. Even Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who was to command the Pearl Harbor strike force, opposed the idea as drawing too much naval support away from the main southern effort. But Admiral, Yamamoto insisted that his scheme be included. In more or less these words he said, "Our island ring defense is very weak. It is far from completion. The Americans could easily take one or more of those islands, then come right across the Pacific into the heart of the empire. Our best course of action is to deliver a knockout blow to the American fleet at the very start. Then Japan can operate in the south without fear of effective opposition. We can build up our island defense ring and strengthen our fleet for the day when the recovered American Navy tries to move westward. At that later meeting, with our strength at its peak, we can destroy it completely." Yamamoto knew the US better than the others present. He had served in Washington, D.C., and had seen America's industrial might. He thought it reckless to fight a war with her, and had advised against it. He had earlier said that, for 6 months or a year, he could run wild against the Americans, but could hold out no hope after that. The final decision to prepare for war was made at an Imperial conference on September 6. The Admiral felt that so long as he had to go to war, he intended to begin in a way that gave the best chance of victory. He insisted that the Pearl Harbor portion be included and threatened to resign if it were not. Isoroku Yamamoto was Old Navy, having fought in the Battle of Tsushima Strait under Admiral Heihachiro Togo, while a very junior officer in the Russo-Japanese War. He was also New Navy, being one of the leaders in development of Japanese naval aviation. Because of Yamamoto and men who thought as he did, Japan started the war with 10 aircraft carriers rather than the 3 or 4 most other nations thought we had. We also had the Zero fighter, best plane in the world. We had pilots who could fly missions more than twice as far as pilots of any other navy. Should Yamamoto suddenly resign from his post as chief of our fleet, there would be great public wonderment as to why, and great public outcry as well. Within the Navy itself, there was no telling what might happen by the time rumours had finished spreading. So, in a few weeks, all opposition to his plan vanished. The strike against Pearl Harbor was approved. While admirals pounded on tables and shouted in each other's faces 40 miles away in Tokyo, I laboured under Yokosuka's hot summer sun. Sweat made my clothing cling to me as I performed the myriad duties of any ship's executive officer. A final check of I-15's hull and fittings had to be made, as well as her weapons. I had to recheck the spare parts stored to be sure we would lack nothing necessary for combat repairs. While I reviewed these matters with officers and petty officers, much rumour was going the rounds. No one had any accurate information about what lay ahead of us, but every man on all 14 first-line submarines moored at Yokosuka was sure in his heart that the next time he put to sea, it would be to combat the enemy. And we were truly ready for it. All 14 boats were 16,000 milers with surface speeds of more than 20 knots. All could steam to the US west coast and back without refuelling. Confident we could meet and beat the best, we worked with a will. One sad note sounded through the 6th Fleet on October 2nd. I-161, commanded by Lieutenant CDR Takashi Hirokawa, hit a gunboat while steaming in home waters and sank with the captain and most of his crew. That was the 3rd submarine disaster in 20 months, all due to the rigours of intensive training that was standard policy with the Imperial Navy in the late 30s. I-163 had gone down in Bungo Strait after colliding with another submarine on February 2, 1939. Only her captain, Takashi Sano, and a few crewmen on her bridge were saved. We also lost I-167 plus Sea-Diota Tadashi Okata and 86 crewmen on August 29, 1940, during fleet manoeuvres in the Benin's Islands. Also, during October, the portion of Submarine 1 under Hanku Sasaki was suddenly ordered into Kure Naval Arsenal for installation of special fittings. No one, including Sasaki himself, was told what these fittings were for, but he learned soon afterward. During October, a special conference of senior officers was called by ADEM. Yamamoto, on board his flagship, the battleship Nagato, anchored off Kure. There he told them to consider themselves and the forces under them on a war footing. November came. In its first week after an Imperial conference, the Special Combined Fleet Top Secret Operations Order No. 1 was issued to a few high-ranking naval officers. It commanded them to complete final preparations for war by early December. The expanded part of this plan spelled out everything, including the details of how Pearl Harbor, Malaya, Guam, Java, the Philippines, and the South Seas areas would be attacked. Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu, who commanded all Japanese submarines, passed the word to men who captained his boats on November 10. Part of Subron 1 and all of Subron 2 were at Yokosuka then. The rest of Subron 1 and all of Subron 3 were at Kure. These, soon to total 30 submarines in all, were the finest Japan had. All would soon be sailing eastward. From November 10th through November 12th, I scurried back and forth along the hull of I-15 like a water beetle up and down a puddle. My hardest task was calculating just where to stow the great mass of materials coming aboard. We were loading provisions for 90 days. It had to be done in a way that would not reduce her fighting ability. Trim, buoyancy, and balance had to be considered while I directed the storage of goods. It took 3 days to get the job done. When we were finished, the entire deck space inside I-15, except for the diesel engine room, was covered with bags of rice, boxes of dried food, and tins of provisions, to a depth of 2 feet. It looked like our crewmen were living in a tubular food warehouse. Especially crammed was the torpedo room, near the bow, with a full wartime load of 20, Model 95 torpedoes, fantastic weapons that could make nearly 50 knots en route to a target. Men in that compartment not only had a 2-foot thick floor of food, but had to squeeze between it and the steel fish in order to get needed rest. On order of Vice Admiral Shimizu, the hulls of all submarines were painted black and their hull numbers white. I is the first character in the Japanese phonetic alphabet and looks something like the Greek lambda. Followed by the number 15, it was painted on both sides of our conning tower. It meant I-15 was a first-line, Class A submarine. RO type, of which I will tell later, might be called Class B boats, and HA types Class C, since those are the second and third characters of the alphabet. The final major item I had to check was the reconnaissance aircraft carried on board I-15. This was first inspected thoroughly at Opama, the nearby naval airbase, then hoisted on board. It was test-launched from a catapult forward of the conning tower, then stored in a special hangar at the tower's base. No other navy carried aircraft on its submarines, so far as I know. I-15 and the other boats of her class carried a single-engined Getter biplane, capable of about 100 knots airspeed. Its wings, tail, and floats were removable. They were fastened to the inside of the hangar's walls and were attached to the plane when it was on its catapult, ready for launching, then removed and restowed after an air mission was completed. More than 20 Japanese submarines carried airplanes. One of them made 2 bombing attacks on mainland United States. By the evening of November 20, all necessary work was completed. Taking one final turn through I-15 with our chief of the boat, I made a last check of everything. When I turned into my bunk, I was satisfied I had done my work well, and had seen to it that others did their work well. So Captain Ishikawa now had a submarine that was ready in all respects for combat operations. Right after breakfast next morning, he ordered me to prepare the ship for getting underway by evening. 14 submarines had already slipped quietly out of Yokosuka, perhaps the world's most security-tight base. American sailors who have been there since the war's end know of the 9 tunnels along the road between it and Yokohama, forming the only land approach to the base. And Yokosuka base is surrounded on 3 sides by water, making it easily patrolled by small sentry craft. Before and during World War II, no one was allowed to approach or live within a radius of the base that extended out to the 3rd tunnel unless he had an official connection or business with the base. And no one at all in that area was permitted to own a camera. For these reasons, there were no cheering crowds to see us off as we slipped away. Only crews of training submarines waved their caps in circles over their heads to us in the traditional Navy farewell. I-1, I-2, I-3, I-4, I-5, I-6, I-7, I-9, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, and I-25 glided slowly out into Tokyo Bay and headed south through Sagami Bay without any other fanfare. My question, Captain, where are we headed, had not received an answer that morning when Ishikawa left I-15 for the flagship. "I will tell all hands once we are clear of land," he had promised. Now nearly 100 men were in ranks on the afterdeck when he spoke. I-15 is now beginning her first war mission. Our station has been established at a point 40 miles north of Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. We will arrive there on December 7th. Unless there is a drastic change in the international situation, Japan will go to war the following day against the Americans, British and Dutch. A great attack will be made on Pearl Harbor. I hope that you will, under my command, do your best and show the skills you have trained so hard to acquire these past months and years. I hope that what you do will achieve a glorious name for I-15. So, I thought, it has finally come. My immediate reaction was a deep sense of responsibility. As my captain's chief assistant, I must do my best to discharge my duties efficiently. I was filled with elation that the Navy in which I took so much pride would take on an operation so vast. At the same time, I was a little apprehensive as to whether we would be able to win out over the world's two greatest naval powers. Within 48 hours, I had something else to think about other than my own personal survival. Planners had selected a northern approach to Pearl Harbor so that bad weather would cover the aircraft carriers, making the weather another weapon in our arsenal. 2 days out of Yokosuka, we steamed right into a storm that covered our movements completely. It covered us with plenty of water as well. For many hours I felt I was at the bottom of a watery valley, staring up the sides of 2 liquid mountains as I-15 wallowed in the trough of giant crests. Over and over again, with a mighty smash, the spuming wave-tops would crash down on my submarine. We, at stations on the open bridge, clutched at any projection available to avoid being washed away in the boiling sea. We were in that storm a long time, and the nights were especially bad. They were pitch black, and we dared show no lights for fear of being sighted by some plodding merchantman. In the blackness, we had to fight our fear, as well as cold and fatigue. All hands soon fell into a state of near exhaustion, both mental and physical. With the massive load we carried, I-15 had only slightly positive buoyancy. This would prove advantageous should we need to submerge quickly, but it made for sluggish movement along the ocean's surface. The only bright aspect was that since we were out of the range of Midway and Wake Island patrol planes, we could concentrate all our efforts on fighting the storm and repairing damage. Topside wasn't the only place where men suffered. A submarine on the surface breathes as a swimmer does. Air is sucked to the engines through a large induction valve set in the bridge structure. When a great sea crashed over I-15, it covered the induction valve opening. The engines then had to get their breaths from elsewhere. So they inhaled them from within, the submarine causing rapid fluctuations in our internal atmospheric pressure, and this gave men terrible ear pains. Also, when seas covered the exhaust tubes with water, exhaust gas would be forced back into her interior, making the engines give off a loud popping noise and filling the engine room with choking gases. Our engineers suffered terrible ear pains and had trouble breathing. It was a wonder they could go about their duties. I-15 pressed on. The weather improved somewhat as we continued east, and I had time to scan top-secret operations orders number 1 and number 2. Y-Day, the tentative date of attack, was Decas 8, Japan time. X-Day, the actual date of attack, was to be transmitted to us later, if war could not be avoided. The submarine operation was very complicated. I-19, I-21 and I-23 moved ahead and rendezvoused at a spot in mid-ocean, then formed a 3-submarine screen 50 miles ahead of the Nagumo force. The rest of us took up stations in another screen maintained 300 miles ahead of Nagumo's formation. Subron 3, meanwhile, headed for Kwajalein Atoll, then to stations south of Oahu. I-8 was flagship of Subron 3, the other boats being I-168 through I-175. I-10 had departed Japan before any of us. She was swinging south to check the Fijis and Samoa before approaching the US west coast. I-26 was also heading for America, but along a northerly course as she had to first check the Aleutians. 5 more submarines made up the Special Attack Force. They were I-16, I-18, I-20, I-22, and I-24. The special fittings, whose nature had so mystified Captain Hanku Sasaki when he was ordered into Kure to get them, were midget submarines, 1 to a boat, each manned by a crew of 2. Each of the midgets mounted 2 torpedoes. These 5 fleet-type submarines were to move in close to Pearl Harbor's entrance. From there, the midgets were to penetrate the anchorage before the air attack and rise to join in once it was launched. Besides Subrons 1, 2 and 3, Japan had Subrons 4, 5, 6 and 7, totaling 27 more submarines. The 14 boats that made up Subrons 4 and 5 were heading for the China Sea area, there to cooperate in the capture of Malaya and Java. Subron 6, consisting of the 4 mine-laying submarines, was to mine the waters of the Philippines and off Singapore, then move south to harass shipping from Australia. Subron 7, consisting of 9 RO-class short-range boats, would operate out of the Marshalls, helping attack Wake and other islands. By December 1st, every one of our 57 active-duty submarines was on its way to an appointed position. As for the surface fleet, all but one of its 166 ships, a destroyer in dry dock for overhaul, were ready for action. On the next day, our wireless intercepted a special message from Adm. Yamamoto to all units of the fleet. Climb Mount Nitka. It read, X is to be Y. War would begin on December 8, December 7th, US time. The tentative date had been made the actual one. The first portion of the message had spiritual meaning. Mount Niitaka, a peak on Formosa, is taller than Mount Fuji and is considered the highest point in the Japanese Empire, by using it as his code phrase, ADM. Yamamoto was urging all of Japan's fighting men to strive toward heaven. Throughout that day and the 5 that followed, the same thought raced through my mind again and again. The arrow is loosed from the bow. The arrow is loosed from the bow. Chapter 2. The midget subs go out. While I-15 laboriously made its way toward the Hawaiian Islands, over a course that at first swung north to place it in front of the Nagumo force, 5 other boats of Subron 1 were also en route, each carrying a very special weapon. Just as the German Navy had pocket battleships, Japan had pocket submarines. Shrink a regular submersible to 1/7 of its size, divide its crew by 50 and its armament by 10, and you have the weapon that penetrated Pearl Harbor 4 hours before the Pacific War began. The idea for midget submarines originated with Captain Kanaharu Kishimoto. In 1933 he said, "If we could launch big torpedoes with men on board them, and if those torpedoes went deep into enemy areas and launched smaller torpedoes, there would be practically no chance of a miss." He received permission from Admiral of the Fleet Prince Hiroyasu Fushimi, who was then Chief of the Naval General Staff, to construct 2 prototype midget subs. One condition had to be met. They were not to be toko, suicide, weapons. Assisting Captain Kishimoto were 4 officers who, like himself, later rose to flag rank. Sea Dr. Toshihide Asama specialized in torpedoes. Sea Dr. Takeshi Nawa, batteries. Sea Dr. Kiyoshi Yamada, motors. And Sea Dr. Ariki Katayama, hulls. The project was classified top secret from the start, and work began in a special closed shop at the Kure Naval Arsenal. During its design and construction, the weapon was called Akan Emono, metal fitting, Type A. Years later, when it began to appear in the fleet, it was called Ko Hyoteki, target Type A. Right up until the government broadcast telling of midget submarine operations at Pearl Harbor, most Japanese Navy men thought these bulbous cigar-shaped hulls were special targets for use by submarines during firing practice. Trials of the Pioneer midgets in 1934 saw them reach the unbelievable for that time underwater speed of 25 knots. Work on the weapons began in earnest in 1938, when 2 models of an advanced version were built. Pioneer pilot for these was Lieutenant Iwasa. He became entranced with their possibilities. When they proved to be very satisfactory, mass production was approved. To ensure continued secrecy, hulls and frames were made in a private yard, then taken to a small island just outside Cura Harbour for final assembly. Access to this island was forbidden to all who did not know of the weapon. The mass-produced version was a 2-man type with which the world has become generally acquainted because of Pearl Harbor. It displaced 46 tons, mounted a pair of 18-inch torpedoes, and made 24 knots both on the surface and underwater. By changing its battery connections, it could be made to run at 10 knots, 8 knots, or, for a 25-hour period, 4 knots. It could also move in reverse at 4 knots. Another type of midget submarine was also built which carried 3 torpedoes and 11 men. It was called Gnome 71 boat and was generally considered the best means of defence for outlying islands. But it proved unwieldy, complicated to handle, and not very well suited to mass production, so it was discarded. Every number 71 made was completely dismantled for fear that word would leak out that Japan was building midget submarines. The trainees lived on board IJN Chiyoda, one of 4 ships designed to carry midget submarines. Training was done at Urazaki, a small island about 12 miles southeast of Kure. It was designated Base P. Before pilots went out on training missions, officials would clear the area of all fishing boats and commercial steamers. There were numerous accidents, with pilots crashing into the sea bottom or hitting target ships accidentally, but they perfected their skills as time went by, doing so in complete secrecy. Even the ships designed to carry these weapons were secret. Our naval listings and foreign magazines described Chiyoda, Nishin, Mizuho and Chaitos as seaplane carriers. Foreign navies thought they were floating bases for amphibious aircraft. Actually, these 4 ships were fitted to transport and to launch 12 midgets each over a specially designed stern. We also had several destroyer-type midget transports, which could also launch them over specially sloped sterns. During the 1941 summer fleet manoeuvres, Chiyoda took out the midget pilots who would later attack Pearl Harbor. They trained in terrain that resembled Oahu. The enthusiasm of Lieutenant Iwasa for his weapon grew and grew. It infected others. They had high hopes for their special craft and were anxious to prove them in battle. But they wanted to do more than simply sortie with the combined fleet and form a submarine network around an enemy force in mid-ocean. Iwasa was convinced that his submarine could penetrate enemy anchorages, even an enemy's home ports, and do widespread damage. He proposed this to Captain Kaku Harada, commanding officer of Chiyoda. Harada liked the idea so much that when Lieutenant Ryunosuke Ariizumi, a submarine member of the Naval General Staff, came to the Chiyoda to inspect the training, Iwasa was permitted to present his proposition to him. "Sir," he said, "our weapon can do far more damage to an enemy on his doorstep than in the middle of the ocean." He pointed out that destroying an enemy warship in its own port was much better than striking it at sea, where it might already have hurt some of our forces in battle. Besides, it was a stationary target while in port. There was a greater chance of making hits. Ariizumi was infected by Iwasa's enthusiasm. He saw that the proposal was passed to Adem Yamamoto. Yamamoto liked the idea at first, then cast it aside for 2 reasons. There was very little chance of recovering the midgets after such an attack. If one was detected before the hour scheduled for the air attack, all surprise might be lost. And Dr. Genda had listed surprise as one of the 3 essentials for a successful attack on the enemy's main base. As a matter of fact, one of our midget submarines actually was detected off Pearl Harbor several hours before Japanese planes appeared overhead. Poor American communications, caution, doubt, and hesitation made the warning worthless. Bombs were about to fall on Pearl Harbor when the senior American admiral received word of the submarine contact. As I said earlier, part of Subron 1 was in southern Japanese waters, while the rest of it was at Yokosuka, refitting. It was under command of Captaras Hanku Sasaki. About October 21st, he was suddenly ordered to take I-22 from Saeki Bay, Kyushu, to Kure Naval Arsenal for installation of special fittings. "We left that same day," he told me, and had no sooner moored at Kure than a dozen technicians came on board. They began making sketches of I-22's afterdeck. Naturally, I was curious and asked them what they were doing, but they just muttered something about special work and went on about their business. No warship's commander is going to let things be done to his vessel unless he knows what they are. So, Captain Sasaki took Sea Doctor Kiyotake Ageta, skipper of I-22, along with him to 6th Fleet headquarters to find out what was happening. There we learned for the first time, he said, of the midget submarine and that it was to be transported and launched from fleet-type boats. No one else was told at that time. Both of us were tremendously surprised. Even though we were submarine men, neither of us had ever heard of the special underwater attack craft. That's what the midgets were called. Between June and September, after Lieutenant Iwasa had his talk with Lieutenant Dr. Ariazumi, several approaches were made to ADEM. Yamamoto with the proposal that midgets be launched from submarines rather than from Chiyoda and her sister ships. Then, in September, Iwasa and several other young officers were able to arrange for a personal meeting with the admiral. Yamamoto was a gambler at heart, and partial both to aggressive spirits and novel ideas. But he was a realist, too. He had no use for futile sacrifice of men who could fight again. Yamamoto finally approved inclusion of midget submarines in his Pearl Harbor plan, but made it a requirement that the midget pilots were to be rescued after their mission was completed. Yamamoto's decision to include the midgets was made in October, barely leaving time to complete construction arrangements. I-22 was the first submarine ordered into Kure for alterations. I-16, I-18 and I-20 arrived a few days later. On October 31, a fifth submarine, I-24, was completed at Sasebo, our third major fleet base. She was immediately ordered into Kure without any shakedown or sea trials. 5 pilots for the midgets reported aboard the submarines. They were Lieutenant Naoji Iwasa, I-22, Lieutenant J.G., Masaharu Yokoyama, I-16, Lieutenant J.G., Shigemi Haruno, I-18, Ensign Akira Hiru, I-20, and Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, I-24. On November 13–14, Division Commander Sasaki, the commanding officers of the 5 submarines and the midget pilots, received a full briefing on the proposed mission. The submarines were to depart Kure early on November 18, stop at Urazaki to load midgets, and depart that same evening on a direct course for Pearl Harbor. The 5 would travel in line abreast with 20 miles between ships and the flagship, I-22, in the center, while within 600 miles of Wake and Midway, they would travel submerged during the daytime to avoid detection by patrol planes. They were scheduled to arrive at a point roughly 100 miles south of Pearl Harbor after sunset, 2 days before the date tentatively set for opening the war. Under cover of protective darkness, the submarines would surface so the midget craft could be given a final, thorough check. All 5 fleet-type submarines were then to start moving in until they were 5 to 10 miles off Pearl Harbor's entrance. There, they would be arranged in an arc in the same formation, left to right, I-16, I-24, I-22, I-18, I-20. They had maintained while crossing the Pacific. Beginning from the left, I-16 would launch her midget 3 hours before sunrise. The others would follow at 30-minute intervals. I-20's midget, the last, was to pass through the harbour's entrance 30 minutes before sunrise. All midgets were to drop to the bottom and lie there until the air attack began. Then they were to rise and join in contributing to the enemy's general confusion and overall damage with their 10 torpedoes. Each pilot had the option, however, of letting the air attack pass and waiting until dark to rise and fight. After making his attack, at whatever time, each pilot was then to circle Ford Iceland in the centre of Pearl Harbor, keeping it to his left, and depart the harbour. It was felt that the anti-submarine net would pose no problem at that point because of enemy ships running to safety in the open sea. Surely it would be open for them. Once outside the harbour, the midget pilots were to steer for the pre-designated pickup point. Mother submarines, after launching midgets, were to clear the area. They were to move off as quickly as possible to a point 7 miles off the western tip of Lanai Island in the Hawaiian chain. They would take positions about 1 mile apart there and scuttle each midget as its crew was recovered. At the time of the briefings, the 5 petty officers who would serve as crewmen in the midget submersibles knew nothing of the plan. They were Naoharu Sasaki, I-22, Teiji Ueda, I-16, Harunori Yokoyama, I-18, Yoshio Katayama, I-20, and Kiyoshi Inagaki, I-24. The quintet were given the details later on the way out from Japan. On November 14th, Captain Sasaki later said, "We were visited by Captain Takayasu Arima, the torpedo staff member at Combined Fleet Headquarters. He came with an urgent message from Admiral Yamamoto. The Commander-in-Chief wanted it positively understood that under no conditions were the midgets pilots to force their way into Pearl Harbor. Everything had to be ideal for them, or else they were to abandon the penetration attempt and retreat to the pickup point, ADM. Yamamoto didn't want to lose the element of surprise just because some young officer became eager for glory. Captain Arima also passed on another order. Everyone involved was to direct his every effort toward rescuing the midget submarine crews after the attack. Once underway, Capt. Sasaki found his mind full of worries. He was very concerned about I-24, which was only 18 days in commission when she loaded her midgets on board. There hadn't been time for I-24 to have a shakedown cruise and pass the fleet acceptance tests. Any of 100 things could go wrong with her, things that under normal conditions would have been detected and remedied. If she broke down en route to Pearl Harbor, she would simply have to be left stranded in mid-Pacific. With radio silence being strictly enforced, she could not communicate with her sister ships, nor they with her. Hardly any foreigners, and very few Japanese, truly recognize what a tremendous gamble the attack on Pearl Harbor really was. 4 of the submarines employed in the operation were completed only weeks before they sailed. The aircraft carrier Zuikaku was brand new. She finished her shakedown cruise only 7 weeks before she left for the attack. And the first Air Fleet's aerial torpedoes, which had to be fitted with special fins that would let them run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor without nosing into its muddy bottom, were barely ready in time for use. One of the 6 aircraft carriers, in fact, was actually delayed more than 48 hours in sailing until these aerial torpedoes were delivered on board. Add things like these to the necessity of the Nagumo's force having to navigate most of the way without benefit of celestial observations, and having to refuel en route in some of the world's worst weather, it seems a miracle that the attack was the success it turned out to be. On November 20, flagship I-22 passed Hachijojima, an island well south of Tokyo Bay, giving Lut Iwasa and Petty Officer Sasaki, crew of the midget submarine, the last view of their homeland that they would get. Each submarine sailed eastward on its lonely way, out of sight and sound of its sisters in the Special Underwater Attack Force. Once inside the patrol areas of Wake and Midway aircraft, no one in those 5 submarines could see anything but the clouds and green seas as viewed through periscopes. The seas broke over the periscopes constantly, so the horizon was rarely seen. In the evenings, when the submarines surfaced to recharge batteries, replenish air supplies, and make repairs, the clouded view was just as monotonous. Special maintenance men went out on deck nightly, assisted by midget sub-crew members, to check the condition of the midgets, a task made extremely difficult by the frightful weather. All had to wear lifelines about their waists. Sea Doctor Hiroshi Hanabusa, whose submarine I-24 was to distinguish itself later with midget attacks at Sydney, Australia, and in the Solomon Islands, probably had the worst time of any of the 30 submarine captains. At one point, the forward section of his air pressure system refused to work, almost causing the submarine to sink. This was an item that would have been discovered early on any shakedown cruise, but I-24 had come straight from her construction berth to Kure for fitting of the midget submarine rack before sailing eastward. So, during a routine dive, the boat refused to answer when Hanabusa ordered forward air tanks partially blown to level her off. She kept going down by the bow. She was out of control and almost past her safety depth when Lt. Moshitsura Hashimoto, her executive officer, who was to sink USS Indianapolis during the last weeks of the war, managed to hammer open the control valve that freed air to blow the forward ballast tank free of water. Once this was done, the submarine was able to regain the surface. On board, Captain Sasaki's flagship, pioneer midget sub-pilot Iwasa, was nearly lost overboard. Determined to make certain that his submersible was in top condition, Lieutenant Iwasa ran out on deck without a lifeline. He was saved by pure luck, frantically reaching out and clutching a section of the mounting rack while a giant wave was sweeping him from the submarine's deck. Capt. Sasaki angrily ordered him not to show his face on deck again until I-22 reached its launch point. Except for Iwasa and Lieutenant Saburo Akieda, who would later attack a British battleship at Madagascar, no man in the midget submarine program was a volunteer. All others, including the petty officers, were routinely ordered to midget submarine training by the Navy Ministry. All, however, were hand-picked. Akieda and Iwasa began training in earnest during the fall of 1940. They were joined by 10 other officers and 24 petty officers the following spring, when enough midgets were on hand to move ahead with practice missions. Men were selected for midget submarines only if they were superior physical specimens, showed evidence of determined temperament, were single, and had light family responsibilities. Ens Kazuo Sakamaki of I-24, for example, was one of 8 sons. Should he die in battle, it was reasoned that there would be 7 sons still remaining to revere their parents and carry on the family name. In spite of countless hardships endured along the way, both the 1st Air Fleet, which had several men washed overboard, and the advanced submarine force arrived at designated stations on schedule. But the attack almost missed fire. All 6 aircraft carriers were pitching so badly in heavy seas 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor that Admiral Nagumo gave orders none of the cumbersome torpedo planes would be launched. He was afraid they would roll off downward-sloping flight decks right into the sea, or would not have enough power for an uphill takeoff when the carrier's bows reached for the skies again. This caused a great outcry among the pilots. They had been flying 12 hours a day for weeks, much of their training being done at Kagoshima, my birthplace, near the southern tip of Kyushu. All were eager to get into battle. Nagumo changed his mind after some violent urging by his aviation advisors, and torpedo bombers flew in the Pearl Harbor attack. They did extensive damage. The battleship strength of America's Pacific Fleet suffered badly at their hands. This would not have been the case had not Nagumo been influenced to change his mind at the last moment, which is more evidence that the plan to attack Pearl Harbor rested on many small straws. Failure of just a few would have made this daring attack a disaster, rather than the resounding success it became. At midnight of December 6th, American time, all submarines were in position. The 14 submarines from Yokosuka were to the north of Oahu, ranged roughly in 3 concentric arcs. I-15 was in the center arc. The outer ring was composed of I-19, I-21 and I-23. They were still screening for the Nagumo force, and also standing by as warning sentries. They had the additional duty of providing rescue for any pilots who crash-landed in the sea after the air attack. Like the rest of us, they were also supposed to intercept and sink any American warships that escaped the bombs and torpedoes of our Sea Eagles at Pearl Harbor. The assault on Pearl Harbor is usually referred to as a sneak attack. The truth is hard to determine. But on December 7th, 1941, as I took my turn at I-15's periscope, I was doing so in the belief that Japan would mount an overwhelming attack on the US. Pacific Fleet just minutes or hours after a declaration of war had been handed, the American government in Washington, D.C. This belief is still held by some former Imperial Navy officers. Maybe, as some writers have argued, the assault became a sneak attack only because American officials, who, through code-breaking, already knew what Ambassador Nomura was going to tell them, delayed his meeting with Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Or because Nomura's staff took so long decoding the lengthy messages sent him from Tokyo. Foreign and Japanese writers have often pointed out that had Nomura been able to deliver his ultimatum from Tokyo on schedule, Mr. Hull would have known that a state of war existed about 30 minutes before Kida. Mitsuo Fushida, flying from Carriere Akagi, gave the command, "Attack! All planes go in," at Pearl Harbor. The argument will probably continue among historians for generations, except perhaps British ones. To the old argument I would like to add a quote from The War with Japan. Published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, it is Great Britain's official naval history of the Pacific War, and contains the statement, "Governments brought face to face with the grim possibility of national subjugation are inclined to pay small heed to the niceties of international law." In other words, the British, knowing that America, Britain and Holland had shut off Japan's foreign funds and her oil supplies, were surprised that Americans could be indignant about Japan's reaction. In any case, by midnight of the day before the attack, there were also 12 submarines arrayed in 2 arcs to the south of Oahu. The 5 midget carriers were creeping to within 10 miles of Pearl Harbor's entrance. Well beyond and behind them were I-168, I-169, I-170, I-171, I-172, I-173, and I-175. I-8, fitted as flagship and carrying extensive communications equipment, stood to the southwest of these boats. In Kauai Channel, well northwest of Oahu, was I-174. She roamed back and forth on lonely sentry duty, watching for American aircraft carriers thought to be westward of Oahu. Conductor Yasuchika Kayahara in I-10 had sighted an American cruiser, but nothing else below the equator. He could have sunk her easily had he not been ordered to pass up any attack until X-Day. Sita Minoru Yokota in I-26 had checked the Aleutians. He was now en route to the Seattle area and would shortly make the first Japanese submarine kill of World War II. I-15 was still on the surface, awaiting the sunrise, when I went to bed. I could not sleep. So, after much tossing and turning, I arose and went to the conning tower. I was still there when I-15 submerged, leaving only its periscope and radio antenna above water. We waited anxiously for a signal that meant the surprise attack had been brought off. The submarines of the Special Underwater Attack Force had surfaced shortly after sunset and boldly moved in. They could see lights at Waikiki and on the hillside behind it very clearly, twinkling brightly in the blackness. On board all 5 subs, as in most of the task force, listeners to wireless sets could hear all-night jazz music coming from radio station KGMB, Honolulu. Fuchida's pilots would use it later for a homing beam to bring them over their target from the aircraft carriers. On board I-22, Dr. Agetta's lookouts could see red and green lights, marking the opening to Pearl Harbor. They could also watch the sweep of headlights as automobiles wended their ways up and down the hills of Honolulu. Around 3 a.m., pilots and crewmen began getting into their midgets. Each solemnly thanked the crew of the submarine that carried him out from Japan, as well as the pair of specially trained technicians sent along to keep his weapon in perfect condition. Then, bowing to senior officers, each pilot got into his midget. After that, the submarines dipped slightly below the surface. Now, only a telephone communications and a battery charge line tied each midget to its mother submarine. Capt. Sasaki teased Lot Iwasa as the pilot and his crewman got into I-22's midget. "Are you sure you can get inside with that thing sticking from your waist?" he asked, pointing at the special short sword Iwasa was carrying. Iwasa, a white hachimaki tied tightly about his forehead to signify his great resolve, and a faint scent of perfume coming from his uniform, took this in good humour. He spoke his last words over the telephone line to Let Tetsuaki Sugamasa, navigator for I-22. "Take care of my belongings," he told him. "I left them all bundled up." Then, at the appointed time, he started his motor and was cast loose to carry out his mission. At 3:30 a.m. Tokyo time, which was 10 minutes before 8 o'clock at Honolulu, the signal for which thousands of men in the task force waited came over the wireless. From Sir Dr. Mitsuo Fuchida's bomber, 10,000 feet over Pearl Harbor, all ships could clearly hear the signal ... repeated many times. In our code, this was 2, 2, 2, the word to attack. 3 minutes later, it was followed by the message, "We have succeeded in a surprise attack at 3:23 a.m. As other writers have told, the signal carried, possibly through some atmospheric freak, all the way to Japan's inland sea, where wireless operators on board ADM, Yamamoto's flagship, picked it up. On board I-15, my commanding officer kept saying over and over again, "This is good, and ordered me to pass the word throughout the boat. I did. The crew went wild. I could hear banzais ringing everywhere. Men were shouting at the tops of their lungs, throwing their arms around one another, and weeping for joy. It is characteristic of my countrymen that their tears flow freely on occasions when they are filled with a sudden happiness, almost as freely as when they are suddenly sad. That is the way it was with the men of I-15, including myself at that moment." This excitement soon stopped. All of us became intent upon listening to the American radio, especially the naval circuits. Our monitoring had picked up only coded messages to that moment. Now messages were being transmitted thick and fast in plain language. Obviously, there was a great deal of confusion on the ground and in the ships at Pearl Harbor. I found myself wistfully wishing I were on board one of the special attack submarines. They had front-row seats. I later heard that they saw massive explosions and a great pall of black smoke rise over the enemy base. They also heard depth-charge explosions nearby and feared for the 5 midget submarines launched hours earlier. As near as I have been able to determine, only one of our midgets managed to get inside Pearl Harbor. 2 may have, however. I think that the first midget pilot, Lieutenant Gay Masaharu Yokoyama from I-16, got inside safely, only to be sunk after firing his torpedoes at a destroyer tender and a destroyer. USS Monaghan sank her. The US destroyer Ward definitely sank a midget submarine, which appears to have been Laite Iwesa's. Ward sighted a midget trying to follow the tug Antares through the harbour entrance, while Antares had a barge in tow. Yokoyama and Petty Officer Teiji Ueda were still inside the hull when it was used as fill material near the submarine base's bachelor officers' quarters, where a new dock was constructed a short time later. Next to approach was Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki of I-24, who had trouble with his gyroscope on being launched. He ran aground on a reef off the harbour entrance and was shelled by a destroyer. Through a stroke of good fortune, he slipped off the reef, leaving the destroyer gunners convinced they had sunk him. Damage had been done to I-24's midget, though, and the crewmen were overcome by fumes from their batteries when seawater seeped inside the hull. They tried to make it back to the rendezvous, but had to abandon their craft off the north side of Oahu when their batteries gave out. Petty Officer Kiyoshi Inagaki drowned, and Sakamaki barely made it to shore, where he passed out. He became the first Japanese fighting man to pass through San Francisco's Golden Gate a little later, but he did it with the marking Prisoner of War No. 1 on the back of his shirt. Iwasa's was almost surely the midget sunk by Destroyer Ward outside Pearl Harbor. Thus, as Adam Yamamoto had feared, a midget was detected before the hour set for attack. Yet, by the time the word got to Admiral Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, our aircraft were nearly all over their targets. It is remotely possible that either Ensign Akira Hiru, I-20, or Lete GG, Shigemo Haruno, I-18, got inside Pearl Harbor. They were the last 2 midgets away, and it is known that the Americans left their anti-submarine net open from well before the time of the attack until well after it was over. Perhaps one or both of them also got out. Official reports show that American warships did attack submarines close to Pearl Harbor after Fuchida's planes had gone back to their ships, and we had no large submarines near Pearl Harbor by that time. All 5 had retreated to the rendezvous point. After the attack, the Nagumo task force ran northwestward as fast as it could, to escape possible enemy counterattack from the air. We, in submarines, grew tense. Our moment was supposed to come now. I-15 surfaced after sunset on the war's first day and kept a sharp lookout for ships from Pearl Harbor, but sighted none to the north of Oahu. So, at sunrise of the second day, we submerged once again, rising once more when the sky was dark. The second day after the attack was a repetition of the day before, until the evening. I-6, under Sea Dr. Tsuso Inaba, sighted an aircraft carrier and 2 cruisers, heading northeast USS Enterprise and her escort. Sea Dr. Inaba radioed his sighting to Vice Adm. Shimizu, who had moved his 6th Fleet headquarters, the old cruiser Katori, to Kwajalein in the Marshalls. Shimizu's reaction was prompt. "All submarines of Subron 1, he messaged us, except those of the Special Underwater Attack Force, will pursue and sink the Enterprise-class aircraft carrier." On board I-15, we were jubilant. We were among those ordered to chase the carrier. After 3 days of no action, it looked as if we were getting into the war at last.